All right, everybody. Good day to you. Welcome to another short take. This is Alan Bevere at Faith Seeking Understanding. And on short takes, we talk about a subject in 10 minutes approximately, give or take, get the lowdown of it, get an overview of it. And so today, our short take is on the immigration myth of open borders. Were the borders really open? The southern border, in particular, the border between Mexico and the United States, were the borders open? And we're going to drill down onto that here. So the short answer to begin is that if it's a myth, then the answer is no. The borders under Biden were not open with millions of people just streaming across. Um, there were no open borders under President Joe Biden. And that phrase was used politically in campaign promises and in rallies, and is still used now that Trump is in his second term, is still used to say, well, Trump is doing some things that aren't right, but at least the borders aren't open under Biden. Well, they weren't open under Biden. So let's talk a little bit about that. So first thing that needs to be mentioned is that the border policy uh, under Biden ended. Remember his first term. I'm talking about his current term, his first term. The, ended some of the stricter Trump era policies, like the Remain in Mexico. It was a program for asylum seekers that they were not allowed to be housed in the United States. They had to remain in camps in Mexico. Talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I've been to one of those camps. Um, and it was reinstated. I mean, he reinstated it a little bit later, Biden did, but it was a modified version that managed the flow of people as opposed to just putting everybody in a camp in Mexico. It was based on the flow of people coming into the country. All right. Um, Biden's enforced Title 42, which Title 42 was instituted under COVID, and it was a public health measure that allowed for rapid deportation during COVID-19 for a long period and only began lifting them gradually. And there were still legal ports of entry under Biden with screenings and detention. This is important. We'll get into it in a minute. But were legal ports of entry with screenings and detention. And what it meant was simply people couldn't walk freely across the border without processing. Okay, so that's the first part. Now, another part concerned enforcement versus messaging. So Biden's rhetoric emphasized a more humane approach to immigration, whereas Trump's was not humane at all. Um, and so Biden wanted to return some humanity to the process, which is what any person who's human should hope for. But that meant that simply people couldn't walk in freely without processing. Okay. But they injected some humanity into the process of asylum seeking. Um, Biden also emphasized more humanity in reference to focusing on asylum seekers for the most part and and avoiding family separations, avoiding separating children from their parents, parents from each other, children from each other. Now, there were critics that said this humane approach encouraged more crossing because enforcement is received as less strict. Um, I don't know whether that's true or not, but to me, it's an irrelevant point. These are all human beings. If you can't treat them humanely, then from a biblical perspective, God has a problem with you if you can't treat people humanely. But the Biden administration still deported many migrants and detained others. And as Trump supporters like to point out, more than Trump ever did. But there, we got to talk about that one too, because all is not as it seems. So some statistics. So U.S. Customs and Border Patrol reported that showed level record encounters at the border under Biden. Okay. Lots of people were trying to get here, no doubt about that. But most of these individuals were processed under law and then quickly returned. Okay. Here's an important point. When Donald Trump talks about the millions of people entering and people talking about, and I've heard every number from 11 million to 13 million, all of these people Biden let in. This is not true. What they did was they took the encounters at the border in which there was no entry, in which they were quickly turned away, no legal entry for asylum, and they counted that as Biden letting people in. But he didn't let people in. These are encounters. They are counted differently, obviously, than people who are granted temporary asylum in order to have their case heard. So they were putting all these numbers together to make it sound like people were just streaming across the border and Biden was letting them in. All right. So even with the higher numbers, we don't have open borders here. Open borders means unrestricted entry. There was never any unrestricted entry. Now, in short, what that means is that the borders under Biden remained regulated, the enforcement continued, and there were legal consequences for unauthorized entry. Now, unauthorized entry is not the same as seeking asylum. When you seek asylum, according to our laws, these are our laws, you present yourself at a port of entry, and that could be, at a place in San Antonio, not in San Antonio, but down at the border, and you say you want to seek asylum. By law, our law, we have to hear that case. Now, unauthorized entry is someone who manages to sneak across the border at a place and get in. That is unauthorized. That is not should be considered as people seeking asylum. It's a very different kind of a thing. Okay. Um, So the main difference again between the Trump era policy and the Biden era policy is a shift toward humanitarian consideration. This had nothing to do with opening the borders. It had to do with treating people like human beings. Okay, let's drill down a little bit deeper here. Um, Title 42. So Title 42 came under COVID, and it was a public health rule, which basically said for the safety of the population, if you've got somebody who's infected with COVID or any other disease, they can be uh, kept out, not allowed in. So Trump implemented it in March of 2020. The Supreme Court upheld it, and they began to quickly expel migrants during the pandemic. I think it's important to note that often these people weren't tested to see if they had COVID or anything, but they were expelled during the pandemic and often without given even an asylum hearing. Okay. Now, Biden gets in office in 2020. He keeps Title 42. He keeps most of it. For most of his presidency, he keeps it. He's criticized uh, by immigration advocates for it. But he starts to begin lifting it gradually in 2023, 2024, with continued processing, particularly for unaccompanied children and vulnerable groups, women, pregnant women, older people. So these people are being treated humanely. Now, what's the impact of this? Well, the impact of this is that Title 42 meant the border was still tightly controlled. You just couldn't walk in freely. It just didn't happen. Okay, so let's talk about Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. Um, they were called migrant protection protocols, not really for migrant protection, but you know, this is what politicians and lawyers do, right? Come up with verbiage that suits them. hides the real problems. So Trump starts the Remain in Mexico program in 2019, and this forces asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases are processed in U.S. courts. Um, Biden ended the program in early 2021, saying it was inhumane, and I was in the migrant camp in Reynosa, Mexico, just over the border from Texas. And at the time, there were less people. The number of people who are seeking asylum, coming and traveling, goes up and down. It goes up and down, and it varies across the entire border. The Mexican American border is very long, and so you might have, say, a spike in people wanting to seek asylum in Texas, but you go over to Arizona, for example, and there's a lot less of it, and it varies. It just depends on how these things work. But under Trump, all these people had to stay in Reynosa, Mexico, Reynosa or other camps. I was in Reynosa. Now, what was the shortfall for that? First of all, a lot of the people who ran these camps really tried to do their best to help these asylum seekers and take care of them. When I was there, people were staying in tents. Coleman Company had donated a bunch of tents for people to stay in there, and they tried to make their life as normal as possible. But one of the things that happened in some of these camps, and a lot of these camps, were women and children were trafficked right there in the camps. It was really hard, particularly when the camps were filled, to keep bad from happening to some of these people. So it really was not a humane situation. But you had the people in Mexico. Okay, so Biden gets in, he ends the program in early 2021, rightly saying it's inhumane. Um, and but later court rulings forced the administration to restart it in modified form with some exceptions and protections. So during the Biden administration, you saw that this remained because Biden was forced to uh, use these camps, but they did their best to try to reform it and make it better. Now, what was the impact of all of this? Well, Biden created a temporary reduction in barriers to claiming asylum, but the program's partial reinstatement shows that enforcement remained active. All right, Title 8, Processing and Detention. So, Trump had high reliance on detention, deportation, and family separation to deter crossings. The idea was if people who are coming know families are being separated, they'll turn around or they won't even start the trip to begin with. Biden reduced that. He reduced the use of family detention. He emphasized humane treatment, and he allowed more parole programs for certain asylum seekers. What does that mean? Parole program means you come, you seek asylum, you're from a country where we recognize that the situation is of such where we will grant asylum after the case is heard. They were indeed granted that parole, and then they would be released in the United States, often to stay with family members, hopefully people who were already there or friends that they were in contact with. Many of these people had connections in the United States. So what happens is you're being paroled, waiting for your hearing. The dilemma is the courts are so overloaded, and there weren't enough immigration judges, even less now with Trump. There weren't enough immigration judges that these hearings could be 1, 2, 3 years out waiting. And so it was just a real problem as far as the way the courts worked. That's a congressional problem, folks. One of the things that needs to be said here in the midst of all of this is that Congress is derelict in their duties, and we know that they're derelict in their duties on a lot of things, but they are derelict on reforming immigration. We need comprehensive immigration reform, and that can only happen with Congress, and they are not doing their job. All right. So the impact of what Biden did was migrants had easier access to legal processing. Unauthorized entry was still a federal offense, and the Border Patrol continued to apprehend and deport large numbers of people. Okay, let's talk about the border wall or physical barrier. So Trump was into the wall. We're going to build the wall. He did build hundreds of miles of new barrier fencing, ramped up border security infrastructure. I have been and seen some of that wall that Trump had put up. Biden halted a lot of new wall construction because anybody down there who knows the complex situation of what happens because you've got Texas farmers, for example, owning farmland that go close to the Rio Grande border, which is actually in Texas. The Rio Grande is the border. And you've got life happening there, people happening there, people going back and forth across the border every day. That's important. You have relatives who live on both sides of the border. And so there are places where a wall just doesn't work, just doesn't work. What Biden did was he halted a lot of that construction and he redirected funds to technology-based surveillance and infrastructure improvements. So the reality is, particularly if you're concerned about the drug trade and about drug smuggling, we need modern surveillance. It's not just a wall, you need modern surveillance. And I can remember meeting with Border Patrol agents when I was there and talking about that and the need to have good surveillance. So if you want to talk about border security, you're not just talking about a wall. You're talking about more than that. So the physical barriers, they still remain. They're still there. And by the way, there are places where a wall does make sense. Particularly if you have a wall where in the United States the terrain is rugged, rough, and dangerous to be in alone. It makes sense to be able to say we're not going to have these asylum seekers, some of them with children, cross into this hostile land. So there are places where the wall makes sense, but the focus shifted to technology and staffing rather than extending the walls. Okay. This is the last one, and then we're going to close up. So let's talk about enforcement numbers. So Border Patrol data under Biden shows a record high encounters, 2.3 million in just 2022. Notice the word encounter, all right? These are not people who got in. These are people who Border Patrol met at the border or inside, but not too far, and basically quickly used what was available because they didn't apply for asylum and things like that to send them back. So record high encounters to be sure, but they were many of them were encounters and not admission. We didn't say it's okay, and they also weren't people who managed to sneak in undetected. Large numbers were rapidly expelled, returned to Mexico, uh, and some asylum seekers were allowed to enter and wait for the court hearings, which is what our law says. So Biden was actually enforcing the law on this. All right, so key takeaways here as we close out. First, borders are not open. Borders are not open. How many times can I say that? Borders are not open. Unauthorized entry is illegal, was under Biden, remains illegal. Migrants were processed under Biden, and then they were detained for further vetting or they were expelled. Biden's policy was more humanitarian, more lenient, less family separation, fewer blanket expulsions of people, and more parole programs. And finally, the political messaging versus reality. We live in a time where there's a lot of propaganda going on. Critics called Biden's policies open borders, but they were not. There was an increase in crossings, but that is not due to legal allowance. It's just that there were a lot more people coming. It goes up or down, it goes up or down. depending on what's going on, and not just in the United States, but also what's happening in Central and South America. So that's it in a nutshell. We were never under open borders under Biden. What we had was an attempt, and Biden didn't do everything to my liking, but nevertheless, the attempt was to be more humane. The attempt was to treat these persons as persons made in the image of God, and they are in the image of God, and not treat them as animals or vermin or bugs or anything like that, but to treat them as God wants them to be treated. So that's today's quick take. Hope you find it helpful. Friends, always remember to give thanks to God, drink some really wonderful coffee, and find good trouble. You all take care.